Hi.
My name is Madeline Hagan, and I'm a historian with the firm Historical Research Associates in Portland, Oregon. Today, I am interviewing Tom here on behalf of the Historic Trust for their Officers Row Memories Oral History Project. We are recording in the Marshall House on Officers Row in Vancouver, Washington. Today is November 5th, 2024. Tom, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Tom Ryll, and I lived on Officers Row from 1963 until 1974. My parents moved here with us from Lincoln, Nebraska.
So you lived on the row before its rehabilitation.
Way before, long before, in its original form in 1963 to 74.
And why did your parents move here?
My father was the chief engineer for what was locally called the Barnes Hospital, the Veterans Administration Hospital, which still exists today. And his career started way back on the East Coast, and we moved here after being in one of about the third place I recall living in Lincoln, Nebraska. And as I tell people, I got here in March of '63. I was 8 years old. That makes me 69 today. And I had been in 4 different schools in 3 different school years.
Wow.
3 of those schools were while we were in Lincoln, Nebraska. So we got here to Vancouver, Washington, and said, we are not moving again. Made it clear as kids, we were tired of moving around, so effectively stayed here until we were all more or less grown up. So.
And did the VA house people on Officers Row?
Yes, and at the time, Officers Row is much prettier name. We called it the barracks. The community knew it as the barracks. And really the association with the U.S. Army facility, there wasn't one. This entire row, as we know it today, was really reserved for the senior staff of the VA hospital. The hospital director, the director of nursing, and so forth and so on. So my father, as the director of engineering, which really was the facilities and operations portion, we were able to live here and did for that whole time.
What was your house like?
The house is the one that's immediately west of here, and it's now at least 2 occupancies, but then it was for a family of what was initially the 5 of us, and that my little sister was born later. And as I tell people, it was a creaky, old, dilapidated structure that when the wind blew in my room, which was on the south side, it would come through the cracks in the windows. My door would rattle so much that I'd get a piece of paper, fold it up, and cram it into the crack of the door so I could sleep. And it went like that for years.
What did your parents think of the house?
They're two similar at times, but not always, views about that. My mom is famous for being the kind of person who could contradict herself in the space of 5 words at times. And as the story goes, I've told this many times, it was like, Mom, what was it like being on the row? Or people would say that. And she said, oh, those cold and drafty buildings. There was a coal chute. These homes were heated by coal at the time, and every so often a truck would back up down the yard in the grass and dump a load of coal into a chute that was right by the living room. So she said, there was coal dust everywhere and all that, and then somebody would say, oh, it must have been a terrible place to live. She'd go, oh no, it was a wonderful place to live. And my dad, on the other hand, when I was a newspaper reporter, I became a newspaper reporter, spent my entire career at the Columbian here, and reported on the time when the row was being transferred from the VA to the city of Vancouver. And I remember telling my dad kind of excitedly, Dad, they're going to rehab all of those old buildings. And he's like, what? They ought to tear them down, because he had to maintain them. And at the time, they were a bunch of crumbling old buildings, not nearly as pretty as they are today.
And what was your perception of the entire grounds as a kid?
Well, that's a really good question, because as I've said, it was paradise. We didn't know it was paradise. We thought it was just growing up as dumb kids, right? But imagine, at the time we were here, the library down the street was brand new. Gorgeous, gorgeous brand new library. I was a bookworm, so I could ride my bike down there with a pile of books, spend the entire day there in summer when it was fiercely hot. And next to the library, literally, was a set of tennis courts maintained by the city of Vancouver. There was a machine you could put a quarter in and get a half hour's worth of lights to play at night. And then there was a swimming pool next to the tennis courts, the old Memory Pool, which a building burned down some years ago, but was still in use then. And then the city built the Marshall Community Center, so there were 2 swimming pools within walking distance. And then downtown Vancouver with 2 movie theaters 20 minutes away, and a giant field in front and a giant field in back with all of the amenities for Hudson's Bay High School. We didn't know it. What better place to grow up, right? With all this amazing amount of room, a big house, and my parents were, I mentioned, they were renting that house in the early 60s for $100 a month, $25 of which were the furnishings included. So they were content.
Mm-hmm.
It was a kind of an amazing place.
Were there other kids on the road?
There were other kids, and it was its own insular community. Mm-hmm. There were no other homes to speak of. Like today, there are no homes to the north, the south, or the west, and a few on the very, very eastern end. But we were this rather tightly knit group of, and there were a number of other kids my age. Fortunately, there were several families I grew up with. And so it became, again, it was a perfect place to grow up.
You mentioned being able to use the library close by and the community center. Did you feel like Officers Row was a part of the larger Vancouver, or did it feel somewhat isolated?
It felt, I think it would be fair to say, maybe without knowing it, it felt extremely isolated because we didn't have other homes. It wasn't a dense packed neighborhood like so many. It felt like its very own almost society in some ways. In fact, I delivered the newspapers for a year or 2 as a kid, and I had probably the worst newspaper route in the whole city because it was so stretched out. Other kids could deliver their 50, 75 papers in no time. I had to ride my bike way downtown and all the way to the far end of the row for $30 a month or whatever it was. So it felt, again, like we were very much isolated, not in a bad way, but insulated anyway.
Yeah. What was downtown Vancouver like at the time?
It was hardly thriving, but it wasn't exactly dead either. There were 2 movie theaters for us to go to. There was a J.C. Penney store, long gone, and a few others, but it was rather modest. But again, for kids, it was perfect, especially with 2 movie theaters and a couple of stores to shop at, that sort of thing. So it not like today's Vancouver, but then again, that was a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. So. And how did your experience in Vancouver compare to the other towns that you'd lived in, child?
Because I was only 8 when I got here, it was hard to compare. Although I was thinking in Nebraska, we lived on a row as well, and it's still a veterans hospital. But the difference there was the row was much, much smaller. Those homes have long since been converted into offices. They're no longer residences. So that community was even smaller. But like I kind of indicated, for whatever reason, they kept changing the school boundaries. My kindergarten, first and second grade were 3 different schools, and we lived in the same house. They kept bouncing. Today, parents would be up in arms about that sort of treatment, but that's what happened back then. So in a way, similar, but not nearly the same amenities that happen to be here, especially since this happens to be so close to town.
Do you have memories of Fort Vancouver particularly?
Oh, that's a really good question. The fort at that time was pathetic. It was literally the north wall of the structure had been reconstructed without the blockhouses, mind you. So it was, I gotta believe that anyone coming here to see the historic fort was like, this is all you get? They had taken at that point and placed slabs of asphalt on the original footprints to the buildings, which were known because of excavation. So they could, and the maps that were available, so they could say, well, this is where the chief factor's house was. Well, that's a piece of asphalt. Thank you very much. Highly unimpressive. Barely improved when I was here. The blockhouses went up, looked a little bit more like a fort, and I think by the 70s into the 80s, then the walls and the buildings. So today, again, it's a showpiece. Then it was like, are you kidding? You know, it's a good thing they didn't charge admission, right? There's nothing here. So, but it was for us still, who cares? Because it was a giant field to play in, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the other conditions of some of the houses on the row?
Oh,
What was your
yes.
impression?
Oh, yes. Some of them, this was really interesting. Some of the homes were so, and still are, the ones that are not residences, they're occupied by like businesses. Some of those homes literally were a husband, wife, and one child in a 2-story house with 20 rooms. They would literally close off most of the building because to heat it would have been ferociously difficult. Other houses, like the one immediately east of here, there's a big family that lived there, and that place fell apart darn near with that family living there to the point that they moved to the other half of the building and occupied that until it started to fall apart. Very different, of course, from today. And that was my dad's aggravation, that these buildings, when we were here, some of them were already a century old. The house we were living in dated probably 80 years old at that point. And you can imagine the difficulty in maintaining structures all that time without apparently big budgets to do it. So that was my dad's frustration.
Yeah. Were you conscious of the history here when you were a kid?
Only somewhat. I remember, knowing that the buildings were so old. And in fact, I'll never forget, my dad showed us a photo of the house before we moved here. And it had, for whatever reason, that at that time, this house had a giant set of wagon wheels positioned along the front porch steps. And of course, as kids, it's like, oh, how cool is that? My dad's like, well, they're probably not there anymore. And they weren't, right? But we knew it was old. But we didn't really have that sort of, I think, sense of history that is evident today with the Marshall House and the Grant House. It's like those were just, in fact, the Marshall House did not have that name then. We called it the Red Cross House. The American Red Cross had its headquarters here, or for local chapter, and it was white and the pedestals out front just happened to have places where they could paint them with red crosses, but it was not the Marshall House. We knew nothing about that then.
Mm-hmm. We've talked with some of the other interviewees about colors on the row. Do you remember what color your house was?
White and white. It
White
was
and white.
highly, in fact, I remember overhearing somebody at the time looking at what's a mansard roof. It's very distinctive and not all that common, of course, in today's architecture. And I remember that person saying, yeah, it looks like they added that second story later. No, they didn't. It was built that way from the start. But they were very, very sort of pale white and unremarkable, really, at the time. And imagine my mom having to deal with, there was no dishwasher. Ours plugged into the faucet for the kitchen, turned it on, and it was this thing you pushed around the floor, which probably was maybe more common today. Certainly today they're utterly obsolete. But and then the house it didn't have circuit breakers. It had the old-fashioned fuses, and those fuses would blow, and you'd have to unscrew them and put a new one in. So they were very archaic, to put it mildly.
Mm-hmm. What was your initial response to calls for rehabilitation?
I think, of course, as an adult and newspaper reporter, I thought it was pretty cool, and that it would be a nice addition. I've said for years, this was the prettiest place in Vancouver, if not the only pretty place in Vancouver. Now, people could say now the waterfront has become sort of a showpiece, way prettier than it ever was. So at least that's an addition. But I think the result here was fabulous. Even my dad might sort of agree. My late father, he would have lived to have barely seen, I have to think about it there. Yeah, he would have seen the renovation, but I still, in the back of his mind, it's like, how are they going to take care of those old places?
So the reporting, how did you get the story? Did you say, this is mine?
I had, actually, that was, see, I have to think about it. That was the late 80s. I was not assigned at that point to the City of Vancouver beat. I had been earlier. My assignment shifted around. I was there almost 30 years, but it wasn't my primary area. But at the time, my assignment was sort of I was a general assignment. I had the liberty, and a lot of staffers did, of basically saying, look, this project's taking off. I live there. Why not write a story about living on what it was like living on the row way before the renovation started? So that it was sort of automatic that it was well, yeah. I mean, there was no one else certainly that in the staff that had that experience.
Yeah.
So.
Did you know as a kid that you wanted to be a journalist?
I thought I wanted that actually there's a story behind that too. That's a really good question. I wanted to be a photographer, I thought. So that little house next door, I was taken by photography, 12 and 13 years old. I got my first cameras. By the time I was in high school, I had 2 Nikons and a bunch of lenses like no kid in the county did. And I was so into photography. I had a darkroom in what was my dad's workshop. I'd cover the windows and try to make print and all that sort of stuff right there in that little house on Officers Row. And I thought that would be my career, and so did a lot of my friends. But I was involved with the school newspaper at Hudson's Bay and on and on and on, so it sort of fell from that.
Mm-hmm. Did you go to college?
I did, Washington State University, which is where actually I spent a year at Clark College. At that point, I was not certain about a journalism career. I was sort of imagining I was burned out from a year of being the editor of the school paper and working at an appliance store. I thought I would study business administration. So I spent a year at Clark College. I took a year off, worked for Fred Meyer, and realized that I really wanted to go back to college. And that's when I ended up at WSU in Pullman. There was no WSU campus here at the time. And right from the start in Pullman, I studied journalism. And by kind of luck anyway, ended up at the newspaper where I thought my career would end rather than start, which I loved. You know, it was a terrific opportunity then. So.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember ever having conversations with friends either at Hudson Bay or in Pullman about your living situation?
You know, I had friends that would come over, say from school, and I think they just thought it was, I think they thought it was really cool without sort of expressing it. That what I remember, of course, one sort of premier event for us as kids was the 4th of July. The city of Vancouver had the enormous fireworks demonstration or fireworks show. And like I've said, it's like then you found out if you lived on the row how many friends you had that you didn't know existed, because everybody's like I said, could you want to come over and watch the show? So again, it was quite an experience. But talking with friends directly about it, no. But I suspect that more than a few envied all of the space and the amenities that were just automatically part of what was the life here.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me about your reporting during the time of the rehabilitation? What did that involve?
I did not, because I wasn't covering that directly.
Sure.
It was really more limited to occasional stories and the feature piece that's been mentioned that I did in the late 80s at the start of the renovation. So most of the actual reporting was done by the staffers that were assigned to the city and so forth, as far as that goes.
Did you follow it personally?
I did, only in sort of watching what was going on and sort of being fascinated with the construction work. Still to this day, I've done a lot of my own construction work. I'm building rehab stuff on my own, so it was just inherently interesting to me all the way along.
Mm-hmm. Have you covered other historic preservation stories? Or?
No, I have to think back. No, most the bulk of my work, my assignment area was rather broad, was transportation. So I covered planes and trains and automobiles and boats, along those lines,
Yeah.
which gave me the opportunity to fly in the Goodyear blimp when they came to town. Believe it or not, yeah, I had all kinds of huge opportunities like that. So it was really was separate from historic preservation work.
Yeah. And you said you do some rehab sometimes.
I do. To this day, I do. I own an old 1940s house at the Oregon coast, and believe me, like these buildings, it's a constant state of projects and repair, renovation, improvement goes on forever. And I've done that. I live on acreage in Salmon Creek, and there are 4 buildings there to take care of, which I pretty much do myself. So,
Did you develop a passion for historic buildings from your time?
that when I grew up, and I have to think about it, I spent essentially all of my childhood in older buildings.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, that we had, as kids, we were so kind of envious of kids who had wall-to-wall carpeting. And where we, it's like hardwood floors, they were nothing to. We lived in a house with hardwood floors everywhere. It's like, well, yeah, but they have a shag carpet. And it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. But so we thought we were somehow being left out of these modern things, when in fact it was a lot cooler building once it was renovated.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that the rehabilitation of Officers Row has contributed to the Vancouver community?
Oh, I think enormously, just in the fact that it's such a showpiece. There, you can imagine, take away, especially prior to the redevelopment of the waterfront, you take away Officers Row and look around and go, what makes Vancouver notable? Without this history, it would be just another suburb of Portland. And yet today you can point to, it's like, well, wait a second, the Marshall House, the Grant House, the Fort Vancouver site, the Hudson's Bay presence here, and on and on and on. It's like far more interesting than your usual suburb of Portland. And then the waterfront now with its redevelopment, which admittedly is it's a gorgeous attraction
Mm-hmm.
to the old time look of the row.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel about the change? Did it feel very different after the rehabilitation than from your childhood?
Hugely, real, because the buildings were so well done. The rehab process, even the colors. I heard once that they actually somebody had kept the color information because people would drive by and want to know what's the name of that paint color for the building, where that would not have happened when they were all white with whatever roof they had on it that year. But the transformation is enormous.
Yeah, and what about the sense of community? Did you feel like did it feel similarly familial, or that there seemed to be some kind of vitality in the community here?
Yeah, I suspect, well, first of all, it's, as you know, it's vastly different. Today's occupancies here are people who are renting and are private residences, but also a lot of businesses. So I suspected it would be way different than a community, a neighborhood of children and families in my time, but still somewhat cohesive because it's all so architecturally similar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you follow the story in newspapers from other reporters? Do you remember reading stories about the construction process?
That I do not recall that. And of course, we also had our competition was the Oregonian, and they had a bureau in Vancouver at the time, and they actively covered it as well, sort of so we did, the newspapers, the reporters watched closely what their counterparts did at the other papers. Certainly the editors did too, because they'd come to you and say, they got this story, we need to match it, or why don't you, whatever it was, why don't you have this story? And a good friend of mine was the bureau chief there, and she told me the other day, I've known her for almost 50 years, and she told me the other day that they, back in Washington, D.C., during this transition, they were literally ripping the copy of the stories from the Oregonian off the fax machine or whatever they used at the time, and referring to that during the actual negotiations or whatever for the transfer from the federal government to the Vancouver.
Wow. Do you think that your story had any impact
that I think my story, of course, my first person story was, for me, was especially rewarding because I heard from friends who had lived on the row with me. One of whom was a hospital administrator in Georgia, but I didn't know. I had no idea. Lost contact, long lost contact, because most of the people that I had contact with, I have no idea where they are now. We're long separated. A handful, a very small group. I occasionally you'd see, but it's been years in that case. But that story prompted responses from people that had lived here, some of whom I knew and some I didn't. And so I heard from them, which is all, as for a reporter, that's always hugely gratifying to imagine that, oh, somebody read my story, right?
And did they share any of their own memories?
Oh, I suspect that's a good question. Some of their memories would have been shared because they were our friends at the time. In fact, it's another sort of side story. One of the friends that I grew up with here on the row, his father was a doctor, and he and his mom, the doctor, the mom and dad, were skiers, the whole family. But they would travel and ski in Europe. He had since moved to Indiana, but he sent me a card because the parents had gotten him a job working in a restaurant in Germany. He sent me a postcard one summer. I was right back there at the house. And I wrote back and said, hey, could you get me a job? And he wrote back and said, sure, I'll get you a job. You can come next summer. So I ended up traveling as a 17-year-old to Germany through the connection of my friend who had lived on the row. I went to Germany. That job had become unavailable. I ended up on a chicken farm in the Black Forest in Germany and thought it was the worst place in the world until I realized that the pretty young girl, the farmer's daughter, was part of the property, and she actually was my first wife.
Really?
So there's your circle of growing up on the row, having a friend from the row, ending up in Europe as a direct result of that, meeting this young girl was my first wife, and we've been in touch much more recently, which has been really neat, and so on.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
So, did you spend a lot of time in Germany, or did you?
I spent 3 summers there, became quite fluent actually as a teenager, working on the farm and so forth. And eventually my then wife moved here to downtown Vancouver, my first house, after I graduated from WSU. So it's like, there's your life story all compacted
Yeah.
to one little tale.
Why did you decide to live and stay in Vancouver?
Probably because, certainly because my first job happened to be with the Columbian. I graduated from WSU in Pullman in 1977 in June. A week later, I was working at the newspaper that I had delivered. This was 1977. In 1971, I was a newspaper delivery boy, world's tallest probably at that point. And within that 5 or 6 year span, I was on the staff. So that's where I thought I'd end up, was where I started. And the opportunity then in the newspaper industry was enormous for a paper of that size. Changed a lot since then. So it was turned out to be a terrific opportunity.
Do you come to Officers Row often?
I am occasional drive through, once in a while walk through for various reasons. Talk about a sense of past, and sort of reliving it one way or another, and go, I remember when, inevitably.
Did you have kids?
No kids.
No
No, I
kids.
don't have any kids.
Do you remember taking people? Did you ever take people here?
Oh, yes, visitors, family, friends, and relatives that have come and to see the row. In fact, just today I was telling a friend, newer friend, she's from Colombia, South America, and I realized that she didn't know about the row, and I told her, I said, Rose, you need to see it. I said, it's one of the prettiest places around, and I think that finally be a good opportunity to show her what it's like. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. Are there any questions that you wish that I'd asked you?
Oh, there's a good one. Let's see. I wanted to make sure and tell about my dad's response. I always got the biggest kick out of that. It kind of irked me. I just, Dad, it'll be really cool. He was way too practical. I don't know, I think about the odd things that, that happened. That this is a really goofy anecdote, but there's a horse chestnut tree behind the house. It's still there today, and the horse chestnut is a strange thing that drops out of the tree with the spines on the outside, and the inside is this gorgeous piece of inedible seed. I guess what it is. And my dad, for a time, was a golfer, and he would set those horse chestnuts on a tee and hit them over the back fence there, and they would explode invariably. They didn't go very far. And of course, I'm saying it like he did it all the time. He probably did it twice, but it was hilarious to watch those things. What else are you going to do with horse chestnuts, right? So that was life. Life on the row.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Those are good questions. Gave me a chance to rattle on at length, which I can do very easily.